The November wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Elias Turner pulled his worn buffalo coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the narrow trail, boots crunching through frost that glittered in the weak sunlight. The sun hung low behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley where his cabin sat, a solitary shape of weathered logs and stubborn will. He had built it himself 15 years ago, when grief was still raw enough to taste like iron. Every log and nail had been placed by hands that shook from more than cold. He'd chosen this spot because it was remote enough that no one would come looking for him. A man didn't settle in these mountains for company. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled as he moved, its presence strange and unwelcome. He'd picked it up 3 days ago from the general store in Silver Creek, along with flour, salt, and winter supplies. Old Morton had handed it to him with raised brows that asked questions Elias had no interest in answering. "From Denver," Morton had said. "Fancy paper, too." Elias had only grunted, shoving it deep into his pocket until he was miles from town. He hadn't looked at it since. Now, as he neared the cabin and saw smoke curling from the chimney, the fire he'd banked that morning still alive, he knew he could put it off no longer. Inside, the cabin was spare but ordered. A single room with a loft for sleeping. Stone hearth, rough-hewn table, 2 chairs though only one was ever used. Shelves lined with jars of preserves, jerky, and a few worn books. Everything a man needed, nothing more. He hung his coat, set his rifle beside the fire, and finally pulled out the letter. The paper was smooth, too fine for these parts, and the handwriting looped with an elegance that didn't belong in the mountains. "Mr. Elias Turner, as per your inquiry through our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Samuel Morrison, we have arranged for a suitable governess cook to arrive at Silver Creek on the 15th of November. Miss Clara Hartley comes highly recommended for her domestic skills and discretion. She understands the isolated nature of your residence and is prepared for the challenges of frontier living. The agreed-upon sum of $40 monthly should be paid directly to Miss Hartley, who will manage her own expenses. We trust this arrangement will prove satisfactory for the winter months ahead. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Adelaide Peaton, Peaton Domestic Agency, Denver." Elias stared at the letter, jaw tightening. Samuel Morrison. He should have known that meddling fool would turn a drunken complaint into this. He'd mentioned one night that winters were getting harder to handle alone, keeping animals fed, wood chopped, and his own meals cooked, but he hadn't asked for a woman. Certainly not some Eastern governess with delicate manners. The 15th of November. He looked at the frost gathering outside. That was today. He crushed the letter in his fist, then smoothed it out again with a sigh. $40 a month. Too much for company he hadn't asked for, but he had the money tucked behind the loose stone in the fireplace. Years of trapping and guiding had left him with a quiet stash that meant little in the wilderness. He went to the window, peering down the trail that wound toward Silver Creek. It would take half a day to reach the cabin, assuming anyone had agreed to bring her. Maybe she'd see the mountains and turn back. That'd be best. Still, as the sun climbed higher, he found himself making small changes around the cabin, sweeping the floor, clearing out the small side room he used for storage, even patching a hole in the roof. Just practical work, he muttered to himself. Things that needed doing anyway. By afternoon, he'd brought in extra firewood, filled the water barrels, and lit both stoves. When he stepped outside, the cold bit at his face, sharp and dry. The valley below lay silent until the faint sound of hooves broke through the wind. 2 riders approached the cabin. One, a young local guide by the way he sat his horse. The other, bundled head to toe against the cold, smaller, unfamiliar. The guide, probably Tom Bradley, led a pack mule heavy with luggage. Too much luggage for a cook. They reached the porch as daylight faded. Tom swung down easily and turned to help the woman dismount. She moved carefully, one hand pressed to her middle. "Mr. Turner!" Tom called out. "Brought Miss Hartley up from town like she asked." Elias stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching. The woman straightened, pulling back her hood. She was younger than he'd expected, 25, maybe, with dark hair pulled back neatly and a face pale with exhaustion. But her eyes, gray, steady and proud despite the weariness, and she was with child. Elias's stomach sank as his eyes dropped to the swell beneath her cloak. Far along, months, not weeks. "You're Miss Hartley?" His voice came rougher than intended. She lifted her chin. "Mrs. Hartley," she corrected softly. "I'm a widow." Tom Bradley busied himself unloading the mule, eager to be gone before dark. The wind had picked up, carrying snowflakes like warnings. "The agency said nothing about," Elias began, struggling for words. "I informed Mrs. Peaton." Clara interrupted, voice firm though her lips trembled. "She assured me my condition would not interfere with my duties. I only ask room and food in exchange for work, no wages until after my confinement." Elias stared at her. The woman could barely stand, and she wanted to work. Tom cleared his throat. "Best be heading back, Mr. Turner. Gets dark quick on the trail." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Then he mounted and rode off, leaving Elias alone with the widow. The cold deepened. The sky turned to steel. Elias said finally, "I didn't pay for this." Clara's face paled, but her eyes didn't waver. "The baby will come whether you paid for it or not. I can work. I will work. But if you're turning me out, do it now while I can still make it back to town before nightfall." He hesitated. She was trembling. Whether from cold or stubbornness he couldn't tell. But she wouldn't make it far. Not in this weather. "Get inside," he said gruffly. "The lean-to's got a stove. You'll freeze, standing there." She bent for her bag, struggling. With a sigh, Elias took it from her and grabbed the trunk too. She followed him into the cabin, stopping at the doorway to look around. The single room glowed with firelight, simple and rough, but safe. "Through here," he said, leading her to the small side room. "You'll take meals in the main room. Privy's out back." "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she murmured. He turned to go, pausing. "What happened to your husband?" Something shuddered in her face. "He died 6 months ago." He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. "Get some rest. Work starts early." When he closed the door behind her, the silence of the cabin returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt different, alive, unsettled, like a new wind stirring ashes that had long gone cold. Elias sat by the fire that night, staring at the empty second chair. 15 years of solitude undone by a single woman carrying new life into his frozen world. And for the first time in years, he didn't quite mind. Morning came cold and bright, the windows painted with frost. Elias was already up, stoking the fire and boiling coffee, when the lean-to door opened. Clara stood there, wrapped in a plain brown dress and apron, her dark hair pinned up neatly despite the early hour. She looked pale but steady, the kind of woman who'd already seen harder mornings than this. "I'll do that," she said quietly, reaching for the coffee pot. "It's near ready," Elias replied, not moving aside. "I know how to cook bacon, Mr. Turner," she said gently, setting the pan to heat. There wasn't a trace of arrogance in her tone, only quiet certainty. He studied her for a long moment, then handed her the knife. She took over with the calm assurance of someone who'd run more than one household before. Despite her condition, she moved with purpose, every motion deliberate and careful. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee, and for the first time in 15 years, the air felt less empty. They ate together at the rough-hewn table, the fire snapping behind them. Elias wasn't used to company, much less conversation over breakfast, but Clara didn't seem to expect any. She ate slowly, hands folded in her lap when finished. Then, without being asked, she gathered the dishes, pumped water into the basin, and began to wash. "I'll need to know your routine," she said, her tone brisk and practical. "What time you prefer meals, what work needs doing." "Sunup, noon, sundown," Elias said. "I'm not particular. Whatever keeps a man alive." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "And in between? Do what needs doing. Just don't overdo it." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or gratitude, but she only nodded. "I won't." Elias pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The snow from last night glittered like 1,000 tiny mirrors, and the sky had that hard blue shine that promised more cold. He busied himself with chores, feeding the goats, splitting wood, and checking the traps, but his thoughts kept circling back to the cabin. What kind of woman rode into the mountains, heavy with child, to cook for a stranger she'd never met? What had she run from? When he returned near noon, the smell of fresh bread met him at the door. Clara was bent over the stove, pulling a golden loaf from the oven, her cheeks flushed from the heat. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "You had flour and a starter." It seemed wasteful not to use them. Elias said nothing, only sat at the table while she ladled out stew made from dried meat and root vegetables. It was good, better than anything he'd eaten in years. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked finally. "My mother, then later for the minister's family back in Kansas," she said. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her belly. "Before I married." "What town?" "Lawrence." He knew of Lawrence. Tough place. She didn't look up. "Yes." It was. They finished the meal in silence. When he brought his plate to the basin, her hand brushed his. She pulled back quickly, murmuring, "I can manage." He went to his chair by the fire, pulling out his carving knife and a block of wood, but his hands weren't steady. Every soft movement from her, sweeping the floor, straightening the shelves, seemed to echo through the room. By late afternoon, he noticed her slowing, pressing one hand to her back as she worked. Before she could protest, he took the kettle from her hand. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to the chair by the fire. "I'm fine." "Sit anyway." She sank down, breath catching as the warmth reached her feet. "When's your time?" he asked gruffly. She hesitated. 2 months, maybe less. Hard to know exactly. He frowned. "Dead of winter." "It'll come when it comes," she said quietly. "Women have been having babies in worse places than this." "Not alone," he said. Her gray eyes lifted to his. "I'm not alone, am I, Mr. Turner?" He looked away first. "You need rest," he muttered, and began stacking wood just to keep his hands busy. That night they ate cornbread and beans with preserved peaches for after. Simple food, but good. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore, just quiet, like the pause between words that didn't need saying. When the dishes were done, she paused at her door. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For letting me stay." Elias grunted. "You'll earn your keep." "I intend to." After she'd gone to bed, he sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. For the first time in years, the cabin smelled of soap and bread instead of smoke and dust. His spare coat hung by the door, the torn pocket neatly mended. He hadn't asked her to do it, such a small thing, but it hit him harder than he expected. By the 3rd week, snow lay thick on the ground. Clara moved slower now, her steps careful, her hands often resting protectively over her belly. Still, she worked without complaint, cooking, sewing, cleaning, humming softly under her breath. That sound filled the cabin like sunlight. Elias found himself listening for it. One morning, he woke to silence. The chair she usually sat in was empty. Panic clawed at his chest until he heard soft crying from the lean-to room. Not the baby's, hers. He hesitated outside her door. He'd known grief like that, the kind that lived deep, where it ached to breathe. He filled the kettle, brewed tea with the chamomile she'd organized into jars, and poured a cup with a spoonful of precious honey. He set it quietly on the floor outside her door with 2 biscuits from last night's supper. When he came back later, the cup was gone. Clara was at the stove, face calm, eyes rimmed red. She said nothing, and neither did he. But that night, he found his best shirt neatly folded on his chair, mended cuffs, perfect stitches. Days passed, nights grew longer. He'd begun to accept her presence as part of his world, until one bitter night when wind howled around the cabin like wolves, he heard the soft sound again. Quiet weeping from behind her door. He rose, hesitated, then spoke softly through the wood. You all right in there?" The crying stopped. Then her voice, small but steady. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't?" He waited, hand against the door. "You want to talk?" A long pause. Then the door opened a crack. Clara stood there in her nightdress and shawl, hair loose, eyes shining in the lamplight. "I dream about him sometimes," she whispered. "My husband, Daniel. I dream he's still alive. Then I wake and remember." Elias nodded slowly. "How'd he die?" She stepped out, moving to the fire. He followed. She sat, hands trembling in her lap. He printed pamphlets about the railroad companies, said they were stealing land from farmers. They came one night, beat him near to death and threw him in jail. He died 3 days later. Her voice broke, raw and quiet. "They said it was his own fault, that he should have kept his mouth shut. I tried to get justice, but no one would listen. So I left." Quote. Elias stared into the flames. "My boy was 8, he said finally. Fever took him and his mother both, buried them up on the ridge." The fire popped. The silence between them deepened. Not empty, but full of understanding. "I talk to Daniel sometimes," Clara said softly. "Tell him about the mountains, about the baby, about you. Is that foolish?" Quote, "No more foolish than a man who still sets 2 plates without thinking." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "We're a pair, aren't we?" she said with a sad smile. 2 broken people hiding from the world. "Maybe broken people can help each other heal," he said. She squeezed his hand. "Maybe they can." They sat together until the fire burned low. When Clara finally rose, she whispered, "Good night, Elias." He looked up. "Good night, Clara." Outside, the wind moaned through the trees. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 15 years, Elias Turner felt something stir in his frozen heart, the faint warmth of grace returning to his life. March came wild and unforgiving, sweeping through the mountains with a vengeance. Snow piled high against the door, and the wind screamed like a living thing, shaking the shutters through the long nights. Elias Turner had weathered many winters alone, but this one was different. There were 2 lives in his care now, 3, if he counted the child yet unborn. Clara moved slower these days, her steps careful, her hands always resting on her belly. Elias had moved his bedroll to the main room near the fire, claiming it was to keep the flames fed through the night. But they both knew the truth. He wanted to be close in case she needed him. One morning, while she stood at the stove, she pressed a hand to her back and winced. "Sit down," Elias said, rising quickly. "I can finish the biscuits." "Sit," he ordered, firmer now. She sighed, lowering herself to the chair. "I'm not helpless, Elias." "I didn't say you were." He poured her coffee, setting it down beside her. "But you're about to bring a baby into this world in the middle of a snowstorm. That's reason enough to rest." Clara smiled faintly. "You've been reading that book again, haven't you?" He glanced away. "Maybe." It was Mary's old medical book, the one her father had sent from back east. Elias had nearly burned it years ago because it hurt too much to see her handwriting in the margins. Now he read it every night, memorizing every page about childbirth, terrified of what might come. That afternoon, while Clara napped, he boiled water, sterilized his knife, tore clean sheets into strips and laid them aside. He checked the cradle he'd carved, a sturdy pine piece with rounded edges and a mountain sunrise carved into the headboard. Clara had cried when she first saw it, tracing the design with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered. "The baby will be safe here." He'd only grunted, but he turned away before she could see the emotion rising in his chest. Now, as night fell and the storm strengthened, Elias knew something was changing. Clara's breathing came faster. Her face was pale but determined. "It's starting," she said quietly. He moved to her side. "You sure?" Quote. She nodded, gripping the table as another pain took her. "I've done this before, Elias." "I know." He had prepared for this moment, yet his hand still shook. He helped her to the bed, lighting every lamp to keep the room bright. "You'll be all right," he said, more to himself than her. Hours passed. Clara labored with quiet courage, her soft cries lost in the roar of the storm outside. Elias stayed beside her, wiping her brow, letting her squeeze his hands until the blood stopped flowing to his fingers. "I can't," she gasped once, exhausted. "Yes, you can," he said roughly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met. You can do this." She laughed weakly through her pain. "You've got a strange idea of flattery." "Maybe, but it's true." The storm howled harder. The world outside disappeared into white. Inside that small cabin, time stopped. Elias counted her breaths, whispered encouragement, prayed in silence to a God he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Then it happened. One final push, one cry that seemed to tear the world in two, followed by silence. Terrifying, absolute silence. Elias froze. The tiny body in his hands was limp and blue. "Not breathing. No," he whispered, panic clawing his throat. "Not again." He acted on instinct. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose, rubbed its small back with trembling hands. Nothing. Then he remembered the passage from the book. He turned the child face down and gave a firm pat between the shoulder blades. Once, twice, then life. A sputter, a cough, a cry that rose strong and fierce, echoing through the cabin like salvation. Clara sobbed with relief, reaching out. "My baby," she whispered. Elias wrapped the child in a soft cloth and placed him in her arms. "It's a boy," he said, his voice breaking. "A strong one." Clara wept openly now, clutching the newborn close. "He's perfect," she breathed. "Oh, Elias, he's perfect." He turned away to hide the tears burning his own eyes. He busied himself with the cleanup, though his hands shook. He'd done it. They'd done it, brought life into a world that had taken so much from them both. When he finally sat down, Clara and the baby were asleep, her face peaceful, the boy nestled against her chest. For a long while, Elias just watched them, the firelight painting gold across their faces. Clara stirred after some time, her eyes soft and full of wonder. "What shall we name him?" "That's for you to choose." Quote. She hesitated, then whispered, "Samuel, after your boy, if that's all right." Elias's throat closed. He nodded slowly. "Samuel's a good name, a strong name." Clara smiled faintly. "Samuel, Daniel Hartley Turner," she murmured, half to herself, before drifting back to sleep. The storm outside eased as dawn broke. The world, once gray and cold, now glittered with fresh snow. Elias stepped outside, the crisp air stinging his face. He looked up at the ridge where Mary and his first Samuel rested. "You've got company now," he said quietly to the mountains. "A new Samuel, a new chance." When he returned to the cabin, the fire burned low but steady. Clara was awake, her eyes soft with exhaustion and joy. The baby stirred in her arms. "Come," she said, motioning him closer. He sat beside her, unsure, until she placed the child in his arms. Elias held the boy awkwardly at first, afraid of breaking something so small, so new. But the baby only blinked at him and gripped his finger with tiny strength. "That's it, little one," he murmured. "You hold on." Clara smiled through her tears. "He already is." Days turned to weeks. The snow melted, and the world began to thaw. The cabin filled with new sounds. The baby's cries, Clara's laughter, the soft rhythm of life returning. Elias found himself smiling more, speaking more. The walls that had held his solitude so long now echoed with warmth. When spring finally arrived, the valley burst into color. Wildflowers spread across the ridge where the graves lay, and for the first time in years, Elias went up there with a light heart. "Mary," he said softly, laying a small bunch of blooms before the wooden markers. "I thought I was done. Thought there was nothing left in me but cold. But she brought me back." He swallowed hard. You'd have liked her. He stayed a while, then headed back down, the wind gentle at his back, carrying the faint sound of birdsong. Back at the cabin, Clara was on the porch, baby Samuel in her arms. She waved when she saw him. "Garden's ready," she called. "I thought we might plant beans today." He smiled. a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Beans it is." Quote, as he walked toward her, sunlight spilled across the snowmelt, and Elias Turner realized something simple and profound. The woman he'd paid to cook for him had given him far more than meals. She'd given him warmth. She'd given him a family. She'd given him back his faith in grace. The mountains still stood cold and hard around them, but inside that small cabin, love had made its home again.